Good morning to participants or good afternoon. I know we have some people that have registered for this in Asia, all over Asia, throughout Asia and Europe. So depending on your location. Nobody from America. I know that we scheduled this to be targeted towards Europeans, our European members, and to our APAC members. So it can be a little bit difficult as a global association to find a time that works for everybody. So welcome, pardon me, to those who are here. We really appreciate your time, and we're looking forward to this discussion with Philipp Kristian. By way of introduction, my name is Kevin Spangenberg. I'm part of the content team here at EFMA's headquarters in Paris. I produce analysis, content, and reports both internally and with our EFMA members. All of that material is available on efma.com. It's always available there. And today our focus is the future of work. This is a topic that is on everybody's minds at the moment. I did a quick Google search of future of work yesterday, and there are countless recent articles of everybody putting forth their ideas, their thoughts, and their theories of what the next 6 months will look like, the next few years will look like in terms of work. So it's a topic that's on everybody's mind right now. But what today I wanted to do is look at it through a slightly different lens, and that's in terms of innovation and productivity. So everybody is looking at, well, is the office dead, and will there be more remote work, which is certainly something we'll talk about. But I also want to look at one step further, and in terms of if there is remote working, if there are these big changes like we do expect and anticipate, how do you maintain and boost productivity in a virtual environment, which we're in right now? How do you create cohesiveness and purpose among teams? And how do you innovate and push boundaries that are so necessary to stay at the forefront of whatever industry you might be in? Obviously, we're talking to financial institutions and insurers primarily here. So to answer these questions and more, I'm very pleased to welcome Philipp Kristian. Philipp is a trust futurist and innovation strategist and author of The Trust Economy. His work has been instrumental in the creation of innovation labs at 2 Fortune 500 companies and one of Asia's fastest growing technology scale-up. He works with C-suites and technology disruptors on building a brighter digital future. He left the corporate world in mid-2018, and he is now working as a global keynote speaker, which I'm sure is on pause at the moment. Is an advisor and a writer. It's taken him to over 30 plus countries across nearly all continents and a dozen sectors. Suffice to say that Philipp is well positioned to provide us with some insight and hopefully some answers to the questions that I have for him today. Philipp and I recently collaborated on an EFMA report entitled COVID-19 and the Workforce, a New Normal. Philipp, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And fortunately, because we have already entered the future of work, my work as a keynote speaker hasn't quite ended. It's just virtualized entirely. And as part of that virtualization, there's also an increasing, I think, conversation around discussing some of these core hotspot topics, which is sort of what we're going to be doing today. So I think it's for all of us, a spectrum on which we are currently experiencing reality is something that's quite new, but there's a lot of opportunity, I think, which we can grasp. If you want details, definitely read the report, but today we'll make this a little bit more custom and just have a discussion about it.
Yeah. So how have you adapted so far to your virtual keynote speeches? Has it been a smooth transition?
It's remarkable how quickly the world flips a switch the moment that there is an actual necessity. I think that the future of work, at least for even the clients that I've engaged with quite a lot in recent years, has been a topic of interest, but it hasn't really been a topic of urgency. So just like all the hot topics in the recent couple of years, this is something people are interested in hearing about and experiencing, but there was never such an immediate urgency. The same goes for data protection, by the way. Before there were massive data breaches, mostly by tech companies, people always thought of it as an important topic, but nothing to urgently act upon. And then when we had sort of, new data regulation and new privacy rules come in, both in Europe and the rest of the world, then suddenly that topic became of interest a lot more concretely. And I think the same goes for the future of work. Like, people have been talking about the talent conversation of that, the collaboration conversation, the role of technology in all of this. But in reality, the workplace and the work itself have never really been separated until very recently by force.
I know you wrote in the report is paradoxically right now the confinement that so many people are under has actually forced upon a new level of freedom upon financial institutions and companies everywhere, right?
I think it is a paradox, and it's also very much a conversation of how this is done. Meaning that if I'm as a culture generally quite rule-based and hierarchical, and I have trouble trusting my staff, then I'll have a lot of trouble with this virtual work environment, because probably that will make organizations of this kind be much more prone to policing. But that usually backfires, especially when the actual opportunity of virtual work is to really try and embrace a more agility-driven state, meaning allowing people to actually do work in their own time with their own tools in the way that they see best and most befitting. So it really depends on where you find yourself. If you're a tech company, or if you're already kind of modernized your culture and your way of working, and you've become a lot more empowered as an organization, then this entire situation will be easier and probably more beneficial for you. This is why we're seeing a lot of tech companies actually benefiting hugely from this period right now, probably because others are just coping less well.
Right, absolutely. And you see that in all the announcements that the tech companies are making and saying work from home for the rest of the year or forever, as Twitter said, and that type of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's welcome, and we're going to spend the first 35 to 45 minutes. I've got a few questions for you, and then we'll open it up to participants who can chime in with their own questions as well. So Q&A session for the last 15, 20 minutes. So to start off broad, Philip, I wrote a promotional article for this report in our webinar entitled From Perk to Reality.
Right.
So for years, there's been a trend toward remote work. There's different numbers and percentages, but it has been a trend. But until 3 months ago, it had largely remained a perk for the best companies. It was a perk that companies used to entice the best talent if you could work remotely for 2, 3, 4 days a week. Essentially overnight, 3 months ago, that all changed due to this pandemic. New reality, new normal, those are phrases that we have all heard. They're used quite frequently. That is certainly the case now. I'm in the office for the second time in 3 months today. But my question for you is, are we headed for a new normal? Are people jumping the gun a little bit and saying this is the new normal? Can people expect more remote work indefinitely? Or will people be so eager to return to their routines of the past and the life that they've been accustomed to? As I know it depends on which country you're in and everything, but will people say, this is great, let's continue doing this? Or will they be eager to get back into office environments?
I think there's really two main themes that we see here. The one theme is that even though we may not have necessarily wished for the situation, once we start building a habit around a certain way of engaging with others and doing things, there's an inevitability that will actually become ingrained in the way we do things going forward. So for the folks that I work with, for example, and I do a lot of advisory work with the network that I have, this has always been a status quo. But the difference is now that clients are far more likely to agree to a virtual workshop. So instead of flying, let's say, cross country in Europe, or just taking a domestic flight here in Germany, we basically now expect things to be at least a viable alternative to be done online. So that, I think, is very positive. The other situation is, of course, that when there is a lack, people are likely to also then want to compensate for that. So we've had this conversation previously. I think that in-person meetings is actually especially important when you are a remote team, meaning that the times that you do meet actually make a huge difference. And I know a lot of organizations, tech or otherwise, that put a lot of effort into these gatherings when they do happen, because that's then the quality time you spend together. The real situation here is something I alluded to earlier, which is separating workplace from work itself. Because when we talk about the workplace, we traditionally talk about a place, and I think that despite all this talk about the future of work, that still remained ingrained until recently. Now we have a different situation because, quite frankly, in our team, when I was still in corporate, we worked from home quite a bit because we're always traveling anyway. So for a lot of teams, this is already pretty normal. And it was to the extreme that we had a lease on an office, which was essentially unused for the most part, because we were just always working either from town, or we were working from wherever we were overseas, or home indeed. So I think that the change of attitude towards space has happened for quite some time. And we've seen a lot of corporations go to co-working spaces as well, which 10 years ago was unthinkable. People even like one of my bigger clients, it's a growth stage in SureTech in Singapore. They were also thinking of moving some of their teams to co-working spaces. And back then, some of their core team was still talking about security and privacy and all of these things. We realized that these problems are easy to solve when there is an intention to solve them. So what we can expect is that commercial real estate will probably be struggling in future, because honestly, nobody will miss having to spend millions of dollars on prime real estate and grade A office buildings. So that's just a fact. But there is a whole conversation around how much space and maybe even variable space will then be required, and whether or not it's more about people meeting rather than them necessarily having a designated own space for that.
Right.
That, I think, is the real conversation, and we are going to see some tremendous change there.
Right. And especially for the next generation of workers that are coming into the workforce that have already spent their lives online, there's no reason why their work shouldn't be online, right? And that's not a new concept for people that are just entering the workforce right now, right?
No, it is true. I think there's a conversation around Gen Z being generally making this assumption of being phygital, meaning whether it's physical or digital doesn't quite matter. I do think that that's true, but what matters more is the quality of the interaction. And I think it's also a realization that interactions will be increasingly somewhat substitutable, as in, it's not a question around let's do our offsite on Zoom. I don't think that's going to happen, but the opportunity of having a substitute to an in-person meeting, I think, has become a lot more real. When I was in corporate, again, we'd seen people fly in for a single meeting, and sometimes that would be a 6 or 10 hour flight. Board members still do this, and there is a legitimate question around the sustainability and the sensibility of doing that thing. If you're about to sign an M&A deal or make any sort of big progress, that makes sense. Maybe that's still necessary. But if it's really more of a routine meeting, or something where the significance of being there in person is at least, to be marked with a question, I do think that the world has come to a new order in that aspect. And I think that's a good thing, because we've never really concretely been willing to move away from the old ways without there being an impetus to do so. And I welcome that new expectation, I think.
So that takes me into the next question, which I know a lot of your work centers around trust and the importance to organizations in innovation. And so if we're shifting to a new paradigm where we're decoupling the workplace and the work a little bit, so when one thinks about innovation, we often think about collaboration. I know you think about it and work on this a lot. You think collaboration, teamwork, people being together, bouncing ideas off one another. Right now, for so many people in so many workforces, that's not possible. So how do banks, how do insurance companies and consultancies continue to innovate, to move the ball forward and keep their organizations ahead of the curve in this type of environment? So in your experience with companies that you've worked with, what is the key to innovation? Is that able to be replicated in a virtual environment? Are in-person, face-to-face interactions, are they necessary? You said maybe it's for an M&A deal, but the true innovation, is that still possible in the new environment that we're entering?
I think, look, essentially the quality of the team is more important than the quality of the medium. Now, if you look at the Agile Manifesto, which is one of the aspects that I have an entire course on at one of Asia's business schools, we talk a lot about the Agile Manifesto, saying, for example, that wherever possible, we prefer in-person meetings. But what the Agile Manifesto also says is that whichever tools people prefer to use is ultimately only in service of the actual outcome that is to be achieved. So a great team virtually is still going to be a lot better at creating output than a bad team that is meeting in person. So this idea that yes, for innovation processes and maybe workshops and brainstorming, it does make sense to meet face to face. That may well be so, but it is not a prerequisite. It is not a necessity, and in fact, a lot of this can happen virtually. So I do think in the end it has more to do with a certain comfort level. It does seem that we are more comfortable being creative as a sort of team located in the same space. But I think also that the problem behind this is that we are actually often going to stick to our comfort zone. And the situation here is that with innovation, generally when we stick to our comfort zone, very little new things are going to happen. So I think even in the way we believe in certain processes that have to be there, certain requirements that we simply have to endorse, we may just want to think slightly differently in a new direction. And I do think that people confuse innovation in substance with innovation in medium. So basically, a lot of financial institutions kind of think that when they digitize themselves, that means they're innovative. I do think that it's very important to separate the medium from the actual proposition or the actual thing that is causing the innovation, which has really only secondarily to do with whether it's digital or not. There are many ways to innovate. Ultimately, the market decides, but just basically creating an app or a digital interface isn't going to do it. So it's important that even in the way we bring about these changes and innovations, or we try to innovate, we separate this context from the actual substance. And in the end, I think that the challenge that we'll be seeing is when teams that are virtual collaborate with teams that are physical, because we've all done virtual workshops, which are fine, but doing virtual workshops where some people are in person and others are not tend to be very strange. And so I think it's also then important just to be decisive and say, we're either going to do this virtually, even if we're all in the same space, or not. Right?
And it's important to take into account, as you know, managers and people who are in charge of teams going forward, because there might be some sort of advantage to those that are in person, and you could be losing. Is there a risk of, say, those that are in person getting to be more involved or be more involved in the decision making and that type of thing if you try to do a phygital type environment and you're bringing people in virtually? It's just not the same. Is that true? Do you agree? Or
see, okay, so what we've noticed is that generally proximity tends to make a whole lot of difference. Meaning, if you're in the same office with someone, there is a different level of communication, whether through verbal or non-verbal means. It's going to happen. As in, if you're in a large Zoom call, it's much harder for you to understand where someone's coming from, what their mood is, how they're feeling, than if you observe them just walking around the office. So there's a lot more context we get. That means naturally, and quite traditionally, we have more communication, maybe more productive communication with people that are in close proximity to us, whether it's through mode of engagement or through physical proximity. But that's always been the case. That's not new. In fact, having worked for several American financial institutions, we had a general sense that the folks over in North America weren't really in the loop as to what was going on in Asia and vice versa. Right. Very much the case. Right. But that's more of a culture situation, and it's less of a situation of medium. Okay. Again, the problem now is that as we've all been forced to virtualize or digitize almost our entire workflow, the culture that was underlying obviously informs how that goes down. And so for some organizations, that's led to employees being in a far worse off situation where they're being recorded, policed, or generally just put in a position where they're very dissatisfied, and maybe they're only staying around because right now economically the situation isn't great. Right. Other organizations have been able to blossom because this was always something that they were willing to do, but there was just never that urgency or the impetus to just go ahead with that full on. Right. So I think the funny thing is that now that we've all been forced into this new form factor, what enables it has sort of become somewhat of a secondary conversation. Yet the culture behind an organization is actually going to be very much predicting how successful companies will be in a virtualized remote future. So that's really important. Like if you feel that this is not natural, there is probably a cultural reason in your organization that you want to address. And right. You probably want to do that before it's too late, because right now, if you're there for your staff and if you're actually demonstrating a willingness to adapt and change, I think that's going to go down very well. However, if you're not doing that, I think it will also be negatively remembered. And this is just internally, like imagine what clients are going to say if you can't serve them well in this time, right? It's a whole new conversation.
Right. And those that manage to continue service as normal is a big advantage in this moment.
I think so. I think that the normal now requires organizations to be more than just reactive, as in, yeah, if your branches have to close or if people are scared to visit them, sure, you have to ramp up your digital proposition, but maybe you have to do a little bit more than that. Maybe you have to somewhat rethink the way you do business and propose something on top of that. Because let's face it, if you're forced to react, everybody that's forced to react will ultimately do that, because it's not really a voluntary or choice situation. But I do believe that people know the difference between somebody who does things willingly and somebody who doesn't. I'll give you an example. For me, I've had an Air France flight, which was obviously cancelled in Europe. The European Union makes it very clear that you have to refund customers or give them the option. In Germany, that option has to be exercised within 7 days. So the organization has to refund you within 7 days upon request. Air France has tried to skirt this issue in as many ways as it possibly can. And this is funny because in a similar situation a few months ago, I already noticed that the default of that organization is to basically try and argue against the customer rather than for them. Now, what we're seeing here is one level up to reaction, which is I'm going to react, but I'm going to first of all try and cover my bottom and not necessarily serve the customer. As an end customer, I view this very negatively because it is clear that the organization cares more about them than they care about me. And it's the same organizations that do this, which also ask the government for help, which also try and deny responsibility when things happen that shouldn't have happened. So generally, if an organization believes that it has to be selfish in order to survive, you're in a very bad situation, because what this leads to is a minimum reaction, and that reaction is usually against the customer or the public interest. An organization that sees the customer as ultimately the first line of defense against bad times will always try and make sure that the customer is served first. And this means the way I react in a crisis, and I'm using an example from outside the financial services industry because I think it's fairer to talk about something, where we're not immediately involved. But this type of organizational pattern we see also in the financial services industry. Some companies are very likely to be favorable to the customer, and others are very likely to try and become very selfish when a crisis hits. Now, behaviorally, there is going to be a difference because employees, stakeholders, and of course, customers will remember you for who you were at your worst, right? And in the worst possible situation. And so to me, the current conversation around the future of work is very much a conversation around the future of your organization at large. So if you screw this up, excuse my French, there will be a lot of issues in the years to come. People will remember those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's bring it back to a little bit of it in terms of the working environment and that everybody is working involved in right now. A few years ago, Google published the results of what they titled Project Aristotle. It was an internal study that identified the most important traits in their highest performing teams. What they found was that it wasn't STEM skills that led to the highest performing teams. It was actually a range of soft skills: equality, generosity, curiosity, empathy, emotional intelligence. These are the skills and attributes that up until this point, up until 2020, have been largely developed and demonstrated in person. I can show you empathy in person. I can listen to you in person and show my generosity and my curiosity in person. We have a number of managers and HR managers on this call. If we're heading into a future, which is a mixed or primarily remote future, how do we cultivate those skills in an environment? How do I show you empathy across Zoom, across Microsoft Teams? How do I show you that I'm curious and willing to listen to you? And how can managers and people build the types of high-performing teams that we know are so necessary and so critical to succeeding in 2020 and beyond?
Well, as you know, I wrote a book called The Trust Economy. And in fact, the core gist here is that we are actually building relationships based on ultimately personal connections and less on transactions to do business with people all around the world. So that means those interactions are very much characterized by empathy and friendship, and they're very core to the way we build relationships, which goes to show that a lot of digital platforms enable us to do that through, say, ratings, through comments, through what we call tribal compliance, which is nothing else than people self-regulating or self-censoring to be on their best behavior in order to enable a frictionless transaction. So all of this is basically about building relationships on top of transactions so that we are increasingly becoming sort of more human again in the way we deal with the economy. So traditionally, the digital economy has rehumanized commerce a lot more than the offline world, because in a sort of, scalable, very capital-driven society, it's always been about the transaction. And I think in finance, we understand that transactions matter, but in the end, the relationships still ultimately make the sale, or at least help us achieve big business. So to me, I think we can learn from how technology companies have been able to create these environments in which people can actually display these relatively complex and very beneficial forms of collaboration with each other, because ultimately trading, doing business, is nothing else than a form of complex collaboration, right? So we can learn from that. And the other thing is that you're absolutely right in pointing out that teamwork matters more, or that in fact these soft factors matter more than the individual skills. In fact, much as I believe talent matters, what matters much more is the culture that enables that talent. So I'd rather have a team that is on paper less qualified, but has a better internal way of collaboration, than a team of stars that can't work together. And in fact, it has shown, at least in my case, from time to time again in my university teaching, I see that people who are not necessarily, the kind of immediate tick the boxes in everything, like people who come from really all walks of life, who are not necessarily just like myself. I didn't go to Harvard. My kind of university wasn't a perfect straight A. But I think that if we are willing to just look past that and just understand that collaboration matters far more than individual merit, we can also start moving away from this idea that we have to compete and fight for everything. And in finance, I think the biggest barrier is that people just prefer to compete and see things as a zero-sum game. And they generally aren't willing to sort of understand that together they can grow the pie. So I think that's the core conversation. We must first address the culture before we then look at the format. But virtually as in person, empathy or general, the soft factors that you mentioned have more to do with the decisions we make towards others rather than what the format enables.
Yeah.
And very specifically, Google has also done work on high-performing teams, which highlights that the biggest characteristic is psychological safety. Mm-hmm. Psychological safety is nothing else than a foundation of mutual trust, because if I feel like everybody in the team is ultimately trying to achieve a greater good for all people involved, that's when I attain psychological safety. If I think the person that's working with me in a team is just trying to get their own advantage or screw me whenever they can, then I am not going to feel psychologically safe. And this means I'm going to withhold, or it means that I'm not going to do my very best. So I think that those are the factors that we actually have to look at. And whilst they are soft factors, everybody who's been in HR for a while, every HR practitioner, every chief people officer knows that these things matter. So what the positive of that is, I think we will see a lot more weight and strategic weight going towards HR, because now that we have to deal with these issues much more proactively, and that these issues are much more visible, I think HR will have a greater role to play in solving them. That's at least my hope.
I agree. You live in Singapore. Well, you're currently in Germany, but normal times you're in Singapore. At least right. When we started collaborating, you were in Singapore. I live in Paris. One of the advantages and attractions of living in a big dynamic city is the concentration of human capital and dynamism. People congregate, you meet people from all walks of life, and you're in a big dynamic city. If more people are allowed to work remotely, as we are surmising and assuming, could we see a major relocation and reshuffling of global hub cities? Is it less attractive to be in a Paris or a Singapore? Or will there always be a need and a desire to be in a hub such as this? Or what are your thoughts on the kind of shifting of geographic priorities?
Okay. I think cities that have primarily had a value proposition, which was for being good for business or being pragmatic, and this includes Singapore, by the way, will have to rethink somewhat, because some cities are both, they're cities you want to move to because of the cultural aspects of it and because of the work opportunity. But now I think the work opportunity, as it's becoming more virtual, is becoming less prevalent. So the cities that will still be stars are the cities that people want to move to just because anyway, even if, it's actually a more troublesome or more difficult career decision for them. The reality is it makes sense to congregate with people from different walks of life. That certainly does make sense. It's great to have the social life and the overall energy of a city, and I think that will stay. But there is a high chance that the current urbanization trend might somewhat reverse because of the infrastructure and the willingness and acceptance around virtual work. And that's a good thing, because what tends to happen anyway, is people who were born in cities are moving to the countryside, and people who are born in the countryside are moving to the cities. Now, I find that okay, because that level of exchange would mean at least there is some distribution. Whereas what we're seeing in a lot of organizations and countries is that actually, because of this concentration, there are many problems. Urbanization it sounds great on paper, but it's causing a lot of challenges socially as well. And we know that because of badly designed or very cramped urban environments, people actually display anomalies in behavior. They're less happy. They pay more for everything. So there are a lot of things about urbanization that actually is posing challenges for the future. Challenges around pollution, around irrigation, around general, the sort of breathability of air. I know people now that are moving out of Seoul because ultimately pollution from China comes over to Seoul. It has happened for the last 5 to 10 years. And they're afraid that their young children will not be able to breathe clean air and will develop asthma or other things. So we're seeing a clear sort of tipping point now where things like the effects of climate change and the effects of pollution have been rationalized in a much more immediate way, because people realize that it's actually not that difficult to do what previously or hitherto they thought was impossible. And I think that's great. Now, the core problem with this conversation around the attractiveness of cities is also that cities have traditionally been competing for each other, and countries tend to be only on a diplomatic, formal level interested in each other's welfare. As in, a lot of the time, it's been about you mind your own business, and then capitalism basically does the rest. But what this has led to, for example, on ESG is that even if I, as a bank, as a financial institution, want to track where all my investments go, I simply can't, because the system is too transactional and it's too complex, and money simply moves frictionlessly around the world these days, at least once it's within the bank system. So I think that we have built a world and started accepting a world in recent decades that is now being somewhat questioned. And the tipping point of COVID, I think, has given us some level of motivation to also address the other big questions, which were elephants in the room, right? And which we not really previously wanted to tackle because they're complex. So this is a long answer to a very key question, but to bring this into the simplest possible form, first of all, the idea of hubs will mainly be a cultural and a soft power conversation in future. So the economic appeal of hubs will obviously be lessened by the acceptance of digital technology. But this is true only to the extent that the infrastructure is there, because a lot of countryside doesn't have the infrastructure that it needs, both in terms of bandwidth and in terms of, even educational infrastructure and overall infrastructure. So there are a lot of things interrelated here, but what we can definitely prepare ourselves for is that there'll be a very significant conversation around these things, which has never been had before. And I genuinely and thoroughly look forward to that, because it's a conversation we must have. And it's a conversation that's good for us. In Germany, we have 80% of our GDP attributable to SMEs. Now, guess what? Most of these SMEs are in places you've never heard of. So the urbanization in our country here has actually been detrimental to the future of our country. And I think now we might have a chance that at least some of that conversation will be rejigged. And maybe that means the future will look a little better for all of us, hopefully.
Yeah. In my, to your point a little bit earlier, in my pre-EFMA career, I was a financial services consultant in New York. And one of my clients was an EFMA member that will remain nameless. But one of my projects was involved working with their middle and back office functions down in Delaware. And I was understanding their processes with the ultimate goal of sending those jobs and those positions to different locations in India, because it was determined that they could be completed in India for a cheaper, for lower amount of money. These were certain functions that were deemed doable and maybe lower value. The banks, and not just that bank, but many financial institutions all around the globe are hesitant and resistant to send those quote unquote high value positions abroad. You mentioned earlier people flying in and closing M&A deals and that type of thing. Will we now see, as financial institutions have managed to continue working and functioning somewhat as normal in the past 3 months, will we see an expansion of the types of roles and jobs that were previously deemed immovable? They needed to be in, like we were just talking about these hub cities. Will we see an expansion of the types of roles that could go elsewhere, could be done remotely, that were previously considered off limits?
I think there's two things. One is technically, in a perfect world, we'll have perfect distribution, meaning the perfect person for the job at the best rate will be available. And yes, we live in a borderless world increasingly. Well, I think not in the last 2 years, because clearly there's been a lot of protectionism, but theoretically we still live in a pretty borderless world, in which at least work can be done virtually with almost anybody. Now, the situation is, at the same time, we've had this explosion of information, meaning it's ever harder to find the perfect person for the job because of information asymmetries, which are simply caused by so much information being out there. So this conversation around outsourcing and insourcing is usually a cycle, right? It's a classic economic cycle, and it has a lot more to do with overall macroeconomic conditions than with serious considerations around talent and hiring and culture fit. Now, if I were to take this in the simplest way, you look at, and I work a lot with the business process outsourcing industry, which is obviously, serves a lot of clients in financial services. And for example, if you go to the Philippines or South Africa nowadays, you have highly qualified university graduates with a complex set of skills, and usually a lot of interpersonal skills, doing fairly simple call center jobs. Or you have doctors in the Philippines moving to Singapore to become domestic helpers. Now, this has to do with the classic asymmetry in economic development, and therefore you have all these movement factors. In a virtual world, I think a lot more of that economic movement can happen without physical movement of people, meaning that the doctor in the Philippines could very well find a way of being qualified to practice in Singapore without ever really setting foot there. And so I think the same could happen in financial services. Now, if you have for an insurance company, if you have an actuary that is particularly qualified, that lives in South Africa, understands, the relevant legislation, they now basically have an opportunity to do business together. By 2030 in Asia, 50% of the workforce is estimated to be freelance. So we can see that the freelance economy is entirely powering this idea that you can essentially do business with people on a more contractual basis without having to go through the hassle of classic employment, without having to go through the hassle of people, uprooting their families, uprooting their entire economic and social environment just to get a job somewhere. Mm-hmm. So, not all of the times people move because they want to. Often they move because they have to. Like a friend of mine who works for a big professional services firm was recently promoted into their absolute top management, which meant that he had to move from Singapore to New York. Now, that's not a problem. A lot of people will be glad to move to New York, but for him, it was part of the job. It had very little to do with him saying, now that I'm in my mid-40s, I really want to move to a city again that is like, no, for him, he was very comfortable in Singapore. He would have loved to stay there. And he didn't have a choice because it was simply the thing to do. And that was maybe 6 months ago. So I think increasingly, as we are, just to go back to your question, as we're seeing this opportunity unfold, we can actually offer talent irrespective of at what rate they're charged, whether they're absolute, the most senior or the most junior that we employ, the opportunity to basically, from wherever they are, have more choice and have more opportunity to contribute. And I actually think that might shift certain economic processes, but it will certainly lead to a fairer and also a much more prosperous economy because it gives a lot more people that opportunity. Right. There are, in fact, people who, upon being given the choice to move somewhere else or necessarily even having to move somewhere, will just say no. So there's a lot of opportunity lost by these traditional requirements, which we have somehow put in place, which makes me believe that with this new mode, I think we have a lot more to gain than we have to give up.
I agree. If the barriers are removed, that really could facilitate a lot more opportunity for a lot more people in a lot more locations, right?
So I'll give you a personal example. Like I would have never been of the opinion that I could do my global keynote work from anywhere. So I stayed in Singapore because of many reasons. First of all, I like the place. Second of all, the infrastructure is great. Third of all, the airport's perfect. So that means I can be home within 30 minutes when I land, and I can leave home about maybe 60 minutes before my plane leaves. That was great. Now that I can do pretty much everything virtually, that benefit is gone, as in I don't need to think about that anymore, which means now I can very comfortably be in the Alps and I can still do my work,
And
right?
were you in Singapore because your clients and your work was close to there? Is that, and now that's gone?
No, but it was a value proposition that to me was both the lifestyle and the economic opportunity which work together.
Right.
Now that the economic opportunity is gone, I just compare on the lifestyle. Actually, I have a much higher quality of life in Germany.
Yeah.
For me personally, at this point in time in my
Right.
life. So
Right.
the immediate thing that happened in my case was I decided that I'm going to relocate for a while.
Yeah.
Which could be a month, it could be 2 months, it could be a year. I don't know that yet. But this is also very much indicative of, I think, the flexibility that we have these days, because I can teach my university course entirely virtually now. So I don't even need to go back to Singapore for that. Of course, I'd love to visit again and see my students, but right now I don't have to, right?
Right.
I can do this as I do several other engagements entirely virtually.
Right.
And increasingly now my clients, when they reach out to me for a keynote, they give me the choice. Would you like a virtual engagement or an in-person engagement? Unless they have a preference for themselves, they'll say, okay, we'd like this to be fully virtual. Now, this is a huge blessing in disguise. And I think this personal example, it just shows perfectly how things have changed very, very recently.
Absolutely. One final question, and then we'll open up the floor a little bit for the last 15, 20 minutes. In the report, you spoke about intergenerational conflict and challenge as being one of the major challenges that a lot of your clients, organizations, and institutions have been dealing with for the past few years and are dealing with going forward. So I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more, and how this crisis could bring generations into better alignment, and how can people from all generations get on the same page going forward in terms of work-life balance, performance, healthier work environments, more trustful working environments? Because if that's the major challenge that you're seeing, how can that be addressed going forward?
So, first of all, this idea that millennials or Gen Zs are driving technology and the only ones that are supposedly on their phones all day is total bollocks, right? That's not the case. We're all using technology in unprecedented ways.
Yeah.
But what happens is we have different attitudes towards how much we trust technology and how much we use technology to build relationships with others. Meaning, to a Gen Z and Gen Y, doing pretty much everything online is fine. It's not that we prefer it, it's just that we're okay with it, or much more okay with it. But generally, it's important not to sort of pigeonhole generations in a certain way. It's much better to just understand how they're different. Example, the typical conversation, and this I've seen across the world in dozens of countries with dozens of industries, this is the typical pattern. First of all, a manager might be, let's say, Gen X, so they might be in their 40s, and they hire a junior associate or whatever, fresh out of university. So what then happens is the Gen X generally, the manager, they will expect the young graduate to earn their trust before they're given responsibility. In a lot of organizations, that's still the case, meaning they expect them to sort of earn their trust by doing exactly as told, and they're given only small amounts of responsibility, first of all. The fresh graduate, however, is used by, virtue of being online and dealing digitally with people through the trust economy, to generally trust people by default. So instead of being skeptical, they're trusting by default. They go into the workplace and say, hey, I'm qualified. I want to prove myself. Please give me responsibility. And there is a classic breakdown of communication, because the youngster says, please, why don't you trust me with responsibility? Because I want to prove myself. And the Gen X manager will say, well, why don't you earn my trust first before I give you responsibility? And that generational conflict is a very classic example of this divide. And this also means that there's a completely different attitude towards technology, towards trust, and towards, the future of work. Meaning the Gen Y, the Gen Z will say, well, now that we're virtual, why don't you trust me to deliver my work as I always have? And the Gen X or baby boomer might say, well, first I'm going to police you to ensure that the work continues, and then I might give you the freedom. if you're having that conversation, you can already expect that that conversation is a little bit like the US and North Korea. It's not really going to go well, right? Because both parties just don't understand each other.
Right.
And the assumption is generally one of basically hostility, because there are different trust attitudes. Generally, when you have these trust asymmetries, bad things will happen, right? It's a little bit like if you're with your wife or husband, same thing, right? Where were you yesterday? Well, why don't you trust me that what I've told you is the truth? Well, can you prove it? And then you already see that conversation is usually not one of a functional relationship. Am I right?
Right.
It's the same thing at work. So once you go down that path, it's a vicious cycle. However, the core thing here to realize is that because people have been growing up with different precedents, the Gen X and Baby Boomer have grown up with this idea that you are first going to, you're first going to test and prove that something's right before you then trust it. So there's that institutionalized skepticism. And the youngsters have grown up with this idea that, well, thanks to digital platforms, we can generally trust everybody until proven otherwise. Once we recognize that conflict and understand that we come from different places, but we still all use technology in unprecedented ways, we can resolve that core conflict, and we can also ensure that the future of work is one in which everybody is ultimately heard. Because without that, that communication will break down very fast.
In your work, what are the biggest barriers for the older generations in being trusting of their younger employees?
So I think the core thing for both sides is to say, well, what is the minimum viable risk that we can take? So that means basically for both sides is, first of all, to be aware of these different perspectives. And then for the side that's in a position of power, to make a small concession first. And to demonstrate that this small concession isn't a gesture of distrust, but it's simply to find common ground between the two parts, right? And generally, if you're looking at this principle behind agility, agility is generally about making small bets and having quick validation. So when you spin this as ultimately being part of a more agile work environment, then I think both sides are not a compromise, but they can actually be integrated into one perspective that benefits both sides. So basically, as long as you show that it's not about distrusting the other or trusting someone too much without having validation, but it's actually about basically finding a process in which both sides can get what they want and the outcome for the organization is prudent and sensible, then I think that conversation goes away. As we all know, most of conflict in organizations is of interpersonal nature, but it actually can be resolved simply when people better appreciate each other's perspective, right? It's the same situation when somebody gets promoted that you didn't expect, and when you felt that that promotion was yours, that maybe it was simply a misunderstanding in perception, or it was something that you simply weren't aware of. It's always important to address the iceberg, the part of the iceberg you can't see. If you don't do that, you're going to have a huge problem, and that problem will get worse in digital because a lot of things are lost in translation when you lack the context. So the more you write chats or emails and the less you talk face to face, the more gets lost in translation. And once that happens, you are going to go down a vicious cycle. So if you simply address this aspect of clarity and understand that both sides actually have the same interests ultimately, then that becomes a virtuous cycle. And that is the difference that then a cultural transformation will make. It's as simple as that.
It's fantastic. That is all on my part, Philip. I wanted to open up the floor for some questions. We have 50 participants. And if anybody, if they have any questions, feel free to type in the chat, and I will pass it along to Philip. We have about 7, maybe 10 minutes remaining, and I wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance to ask Philip some questions while we have him with us. So I'll give it a second if anybody has any questions. And I'll keep an eye on the chat, so feel free. It's fantastic insight, Philip.
This was, I think, we covered a lot of ground. So maybe people just have some time to digest it, possibly.
Yeah, I know. Feel free to ask in the Q&A tool. We have the questions and responses tool down in the bottom. I know that there's, as everybody is using, hopping from different chat, from different video conferencing tool to video conferencing tool, right? There's a big battle right now between Microsoft Teams and Slack and Zoom and everybody. Sylvia says, thanks for the interview. We do have a question here from Guido Guzella. It says, would you recommend Agile or other methods to accelerate change in organizations after COVID?
Right. Guido, great question. I want to start out by saying that Agile is actually not a method, but it's much more an underlying mindset, meaning that Agile is actually method agnostic. So in most organizations, embracing agility has benefits, but the foundations for doing so are, first of all, one really important thing, which is mutual trust. What that means is that as long as people in the organization believe in the good intentions of the people around them to contribute to a greater good, which may sound very esoteric, but it's actually a simple thing. It's like, do we all believe that we share a purpose, which is in this case to serve our stakeholders and particularly our customers? When that is the foundation, and when people believe that by being collectively selfless, they can actually maximize their own gain, it's as simple as that, then basically a foundation is met upon which you can build agility. If you do not do this, and in fact, let's say a very famous financial institution in Asia tried to embrace agile transformation, and they did it in such a way that they built it on an existing culture which was very competitive and political. Now what happened is they dramatically increased bureaucracy and frustration, because instead of having one stage gate, that one stage gate for, let's say, $1 million became 10 stage gates, each for $100,000, each with the same business case that was previously required for $1 million. That's not agility, that's madness. So I'd like to say, you know, that the simplest thing here is that after COVID, people will have been somewhat, I think, accustomed to the digital way. And I think people overall will have become a little bit more friendly and hospitable towards each other. I'm noticing that there is a lot more empathy now, just because we're all in this together and we all have felt the effects of COVID on our own lives. And I think that's a great foundation to rethink purpose for your organization, as in, why do we do what we do and how can we be slightly different in that? So as you reestablish ground, I think that is a perfect foundation upon which then to infuse your organization with an agile mindset. And then thereafter, you can choose the methods and the tools and the technology stack that enables this. But it's really important to understand that the first principle here is a shared foundation in which we all are willing to accept that working together is better than working against each other. And upon that, we can drive the principle and the mindset of agility. And upon that, we can then build methods. And upon that, we can then build tools and technologies. And may I urge you strongly to keep that sequence, because doing it the other way around usually backfires. I hope that helps, Guido. And let's see, we have a few other questions, but feel free to ask me in more detail as well.
Yeah.
Thanks, much appreciated.
We have a question from Sylvia. Do you think that this new normal will be an opportunity for gender equality? How will this interact with the efforts and the push towards gender equality around the world?
So this is a topic very close to my heart, because I've never understood why there is such an issue still prevalent in our day-to-day economy. It doesn't make sense. I do think that now that we've maybe accustomed ourselves to the fact that some people may raise their kids at home, some people may be, you know, taking a nap in the middle of the day and working at night because that's just the way they work. Maybe there is going to be more acceptance and tolerance of different ways. I would strongly hope so. The reality of, I think, gender inequality, as far as I understand it, has also to do often with preferred management and negotiation styles. So I know, for example, that based on my experience, I've coached a lot of my female friends on negotiating salary and negotiating job terms, because I have a feeling that, at least from my own circle, I noticed that there is more willingness to try and collaborate and less willingness to try and assert oneself in such a salary negotiation. So I think a lot of this boils down to simple soft factors and social conventions that are unfortunately imbued on us throughout our life. So I know that, at least for a lot of my friends, this is a question of assertiveness, and this is a question of maybe being like flying less of one's flag than one should be doing. I think that a lot of these conversations may actually become less relevant because when I'm talking virtually with someone, it might be easier to just, you know, hopefully maintain a level of tolerance and acceptance than it is perhaps when these conversations, through whatever reason, are happening in the workplace. But maybe that's just wishful thinking. However, I do believe that the reality is that a lot of the underlying behaviors which prevent gender equality are probably not spoken about because people don't always realize what they are. It's very easy to say this has to do with, you know, bad behavior and with status quo bias, and it's probably true. But there are a lot of underlying factors that maybe people don't even realize they're making these decisions, or they're not necessarily sure why these situations happen. So I would greatly hope that overall, as we're exploring the future of work, we make that future a more equal one. But I would also be hoping, as somebody who has dealt with ageism for most of his career, that we also stop thinking of, you know, someone who's 55 is naturally being eligible to be paid more than somebody who's 25, because they don't necessarily, just by virtue of their age, are better for the job. There is a chance that in this day and age, where maybe the entire workforce and is reshuffled towards focusing on skills rather than on this classic provenance and convention, it would open up opportunities for us to be generally a lot more fairer to each other. Because I think the problem is that as we've seen with the remote work conversation, there is no reason why somebody, let's say, in a Southeast Asian regional country would be paid less than the same person doing the same job of a different gender, or just simply being located in a different office. The reason is usually external.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as the economy is becoming not just, you know, pro forma virtual, but is actually realizing that all of our economic interactions are increasingly happening virtually, maybe we're going to look past these legacy factors and we're going to achieve a fairer workplace. And I very much hope that we can all do our part in doing that.
Great. We have maybe one final question for you, Philip, before you wrap up here. From Gutska, I apologize, I'm butchering that pronunciation. I believe it's probably a Turkish name. How can soft skills be measured in traditional banks? I know we have a number of members. You know, EFMA's network is a lot of traditional financial institutions. We talked about the soft skills and how important they are. How can those be measured?
So I believe that there is room for something beyond an employee engagement measurement. So what we've piloted is a sort of trust assessment where we go through scientifically validated factors. This is about 100 factors, which we then individually distribute down to about 20 questions. And through those questions, we're actually able to get a very, very good pulse of the organization. And we're basically saying that with the foundation of trust, we can actually start asserting soft skills based on how productive they are to helping collaboration and helping the organization succeed. This has to do with inter-organizational alignment. You can think of this like a magnet. I can have a piece of iron. If it's not magnetized, it has the potential, but everybody's moving in different directions, right? Whereas if I magnetize that, suddenly everybody's moving in one direction and I have a lot more progress and a lot more wealth and ultimately ability to generate positive contribution. So this is essentially what we're doing to see how these different, you know, magnetic poles are basically misaligned and what it will take to tell one cohesive story so that they can become realigned. That's our approach to doing it. I'm sure there are many others, but this is an approach that we've seen a lot of interest in. So the idea is really that instead of doing a simple employee engagement survey as you do, you just add that layer on top. And then based on that, you can actually see where there are information and otherwise asymmetries, because those are the asymmetries that kill that collective spirit and that basically stand in the way of achieving more. So measuring soft skills requires understanding the cultural foundations, which requires understanding, at least in part, the trust dynamics between people. Because if Department A doesn't like Department B, it doesn't matter whether they have the soft skills, they still won't collaborate properly.
Right.
Fair enough?
Yep. Great. I think we're now a few minutes over time. It's 11:34.
Thanks, everyone.
Philip, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Phil, do you want to provide your information if anyone wants to reach out further to get in touch with you regarding possible work or
Sure.
your
So I mean, and I think I'm fairly easy to find, but also in case that becomes relevant, I am going to share my email address, which you can basically send me all your questions or requests. And if there's anything else that, you know, any problems you are facing that maybe you'd like to talk about in private, I'll be more than happy to entertain that. And I very much trust that this has been an interesting and value-adding session for everyone. So thanks for that. I think I just sent it. If there's any further commentary, please do
Great.
reach out.
I have
And
no doubts.
download the report as well. That would be very helpful.
Yes, absolutely. I have no doubt this has been valuable for everybody. And thank you so much for your time, Philip. It was great working with you on the report. If you want to access that, it's available at fma.com. It's easy to find there. And if anyone also wants to share their experiences and their plans regarding their future workforce planning, right now, FMA is obviously in the business of knowledge sharing among our network of global financial institutions and insurers. So we know everybody is going through the same experiences and has the same concerns and worries as we look towards the future. That has a lot of uncertainty surrounding it and is planning for this future. Some of my upcoming work will continue to look at this idea of the future of work, and we'll be assembling material from FMA members as to how they're approaching this. And we want to facilitate a knowledge share so that everybody can plan more effectively for the future. Philip, do you have any final thoughts? Thank you so much for your time once again.
Oh, great. Thanks for that. Thanks, everyone. And yeah.
Okay. Everybody have a great rest of their day, Thursday. Philip, thank you so much once again. Thank you to everyone for participating, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.